This is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. So we are picking up from page 149 of the translation. This is in the sort of additional chapter in the 1967 edition. So the first edition, I think, was 1958. And then he adds this long chapter sort of looking at the developments within cybernetics or information technology in general over the almost 10 years since the first edition, and sort of seeing to what extent his earlier arguments are still applicable, or what has to be changed, etc. And this, of course, was a very important period in the development of computers and information technology. So this is like space race era, where these sort of building-sized computers are being made for calculating these trajectories and so on. But I think he is, his general position is that the outlines of the arguments from the first edition are still applicable to the machines of the 1960s as well. That there hasn't been like a fundamental change in the way these machines operate. So he looks at some of the, I guess, ideological presentation of the role of computers, which of course has again changed quite a bit between the 1950s and 1960s. So in the 1960s, this is like a very powerful ideology that you just sort of feed data into the computer, and the computer gives you like the answer to your question in this kind of automatic and objective way. And so you have people saying things like, oh, we just need to like to run our company, we just need to feed in like the sales and the cost of the inputs or whatever into this computer program, and then it will just like tell us what we should do. And of course, anyone who actually tried to do that would not probably have a very successful company, especially if you're using 1960s computers. But I think it's pretty remarkable how closely this kind of enthusiasm for the sort of automated operations in the 1960s maps onto the enthusiasm for like different AI technologies today, where you have the same kind of idea that you can just like sort of transfer responsibility for decision making over to this automated process. Of course, the processes that are in use today are much more sophisticated than the ones that he was describing in the 1960s. But the same sort of problem, the same sort of basic problem, I think, is that you have like the automated process can only sort of do what it's set up to do. You give it a certain task or a certain set of principles that it's supposed to use, and it just does that, whether doing that makes sense or not. So one point that he makes, I'm not sure exactly where, but he points out that these kind of learning machines, which already existed at that time, but are of course like dominant now. The machine learning is sort of the central form of artificial intelligence today. These learning machines, you can sort of set them up to learn a certain kind of pattern or a certain kind of rule or whatever it is, but they are very bad at like determining whether they're missing information that would be relevant to whatever task they're supposed to perform. And this is something we see, still like a central problem with the large language model approach to AI, where if you ask ChatGPT something and it doesn't have access to like some sort of reliable source of information to answer that question, it will just make something up that sort of looks like a plausible answer to that question, and it has no way of sort of assessing whether it's actually capable of answering the question in a reliable way. It just sort of produces text that resembles an answer. And yeah, so this obviously is quite different than the way a human, like you don't have to be like a sort of expert in this specialized topic to be able to look at a question and say, I don't know how to answer that question. Although some people of course are quite happy to answer questions that they don't know the answer to. But if you were to walk into an exam in, I don't know, nuclear physics or whatever, and you see the questions and you just like don't even recognize the words or what the symbols mean, etc., you would, you know, probably just sort of give up and walk out, or at least write on the paper, I don't know what I'm doing here or something. You wouldn't just sort of confidently write in something that looks like an answer, which is exactly what ChatGPT does. And so this is kind of like a general problem with this sort of machine automated process as a kind of substitute for a human decision maker, in the sense that it's always this automated process is always framed. It's always sort of bound to a certain set of rules or a certain set of parameters or whatever it is. It's set up to function in a certain way, but it's that sort of decision to set it up in that way is not something that the machine itself can like evaluate or put into question or whatever it is. Whereas a human who in say a company or some sort of organization who is given a certain task can, to some extent, depending on how the organization is set up and the person's life history and so on, that they can look at that task and the situation that they're supposed to do that task in and say, this doesn't make any sense. If I try to do this, it will like burn down the building or something. So yeah, the person, no matter how sort of limited their decision-making power in that organization is, can still at least sort of step out of that situation to some extent and evaluate whether doing this action in this situation is a good idea or not, in a way that the automated systems are not really capable of doing. And so I think it's this kind of stepping outside of the situation is kind of a reflection of what Ruyer calls this absolute overview. I think that's the term, the translation, survol absolu. But yeah, it's this capacity to sort of like not just do a step-by-step sort of process where you are in one state and then you follow a rule and change that state into a succeeding state and then follow a different rule to get to the next state after that, and sort of go step by step through this process the way that a machine does. The person is capable of sort of zooming out and looking at the whole sequence of steps and the whole like process, the whole sort of task that is being performed by following these steps, and say, does this task actually make any sense in this situation, or is it achieving what is supposed to be achieved, etc. And so it's this kind of fundamental difference, I think, that he wants to insist on is this the capacity to sort of make that analysis from the outside, or to sort of view the whole process and not just sort of follow step by step through the process. And that's the contrast that he wants to emphasize here. And so he looks at some of these examples of learning machines and machines that maybe you would or that where you could make a case that they're doing something more than just this kind of step by step process. So in the case of these chess playing machines, just given the sort of combinatorics of a chess game, there's more possible chess games than there are atoms in the universe. So you can't get a computer to sort of learn how to play chess just by running through all the possible chess games and finding which ones lead to a victory. You have to sort of build in some kind of chess strategy in the computer. It can't just be purely brute force. And so you could sort of by hand give it like rules about a queen is more valuable than a pawn or something like that. That would be one way of doing things. Or you can set up the computer to learn from existing chess games, or some combination of those two strategies. But in any case, you can't just sort of rely on brute force to get the correct results. So you do have to have some way of incorporating knowledge of chess into the functioning of the computer. And so it seems like this is maybe more sophisticated than just a purely sort of mechanistic one step after another process. But he points out that this chess, like a computer that can learn how to play chess, is completely incapable of learning how to, I don't know, recognize cars in a picture, or learning how to identify a person's voice, or any other sort of tasks that are not sort of directly related to chess playing. So again, you have this kind of limited scope of the task that the system is capable of learning how to perform. And then, of course, even more fundamentally, the computer that you set up to learn how to play chess is not capable of deciding that learning to play chess is dumb and it wants to do something else. Whereas a person, of course, you could tell them, you have to learn how to play chess, and they could say, I don't like chess, and I'm going to do something else. Uh, so again, it's this kind of limited scope. No matter how much you sort of expand the capacities of these computers to, be more flexible and learn rather than having these sort of built-in fixed rules. At the same time, that computer system is always going to be sort of framed rather than framing, in contrast to a person. Okay, so yeah, we can pick up from 149, the heading at the top of the page.
I can read. The perception of forms in reading. Quote unquote learning machines are like the quote conquest of the cosmos, unquote. The progress realized so far, in virtue of its little significance on a truly cosmic scale, has mainly demonstrated that the goal is barely attainable. A voyage to the Sirius system or the Andromeda Nebula is completely out of the question. The mere quote unquote perception or quote recognition of forms, unquote, by advanced scanning techniques aided by simplification methods using key effects, is already challenging. It is only possible on condition that the forms to be perceived are sufficiently standardized. The recognition by the machine of the letter A as A depends on something more than the search for the coincidence of the form with an exemplary model, cliché, in its quote-unquote memory. Some concept of the quote-unquote A-ness, if we can put it this way, must be formed. This quasi-concept, being mechanical, can only be found in some traits common to the various forms that the same letter contains, while being able to be distinguished from the forms of other letters. To achieve this, we can proceed by first scanning the letter with a constant frame and recording the groups of characteristics matching points of the letter as a sequence of signals. Then we search for the maximal simplification or the minimum of identification functions by analyzing these groups of points solely from the perspective of their internal homogeneity or heterogeneity, for example. The machine itself is used for this search. We try for all the possible quote-unquote templates, and we select the sequences that are sufficiently discriminating and have an acceptable probability of error. And there are 3 diagrams of the letter J, capital J, being, I guess, minimalized through these identification functions. It is labeled minimalization of identification functions. And A is the original character in its envelope. B, so it's just like a hand-drawn J. B is a outline type envelope character quantified in 3 levels, which is on a grid with different shades, 3 different shades. And then the third is the reduced outline type, and it's just a few black and white dots on a gray grid. An analogous procedure can be applied to other perceptual discriminations in man as well as in machine. For example, R.N. Shepard has demonstrated that the auditory or visual discriminations of Morse code signals are essentially made on the basis of 2 characteristics of these signals. 1, their length, and 2, their degree of internal heterogeneity. For example, we recognize, the human reader spontaneously employs methods similar to those of the machine. For example, we recognize, especially in handwriting, an M, an N, a double N, and a double M by different length in the same internal homogeneity. Of course, reading by a magnetic head or optical system is easy when the writing is completely standardized. The machine can then employ any coded external criteria. For example, the American Bankers Association's machine for automatically reading standardized magnetic characters. But clearly the real problem is the reading of letters and writing that is not standardized, about which the machine would have no a priori geometric or topological information. It would then need to be programmed in such a way that it would devise its own criteria for identification. In theory, a reading machine can always succeed in devising some criteria for identification through quote-unquote forced learning, if one can speak of learning in this context, because the machine or its various assemblies is here no different to a series of tools that a man tries out in order to keep the best. So unlike some of the other sections in this book and conclusion, this one has not aged as well. And there are machine vision programs that are quite good at recognizing, identifying objects. Although they still have difficulty, as I understand it, with like a machine learning AI that can recognize like bicycles, for instance, might not be able to recognize like a bicycle from overhead in the dark in the grass or in sort of less likely positions and circumstances that, you know, would still obviously be a bicycle and an observer. So I don't know. It would be interesting to get Ria's thoughts on the capacities and limitations of newer machine learning.
Yeah, so yeah, you're right that a lot of this is now, it is a solved problem. The optical character recognition, taking a printed or handwritten sequence of letters or numbers or whatever, and turning it into a sort of representation of the characters. This is something that is pretty good now. Especially for printed text. I think not quite as good with handwriting. But there's also I'm sure everyone has experienced those captchas where it's like a bunch of letters that are like at different angles and there's like lines through them and stuff. And the point of that, of course, is that humans are still better at doing that identification of the letters and numbers in this kind of obscure circumstance, like where the lines are hard to discern from like the background and other things, and they're at different orientations and everything. Humans are still better at doing this than most of the existing OCR techniques. Although in a lot of cases it's not that like it's impossible to do. It's just that it's sort of the economics of it. It's just that like operating this kind of system to defeat one of these CAPTCHA tests is like it would cost more than it is really worthwhile to do. So like the technique exists. It's just that it's not really cheap enough to sort of use it widely. But it's also worth mentioning that so the problem that he's pointing out here is solved, but it was not easy to solve. Like it's only in like maybe the early 2000s that you started to have like good optical character recognition software that could be widely deployed. So it took like 50 years of work essentially to get this for what for a human is like sort of a trivial task of it's something we don't even really like, we're not even consciously aware of what we're doing when you like, if you try to explain to someone what is it about the letter A that you can recognize it in different orientations and fonts and whatever. You wouldn't really be able to explain like what is the property of the letter A that you are recognizing. But yeah, so this task, which is like sort of automatic in humans, that is like below the level of even of conscious awareness, is something that took decades of work to get a computer to do. And then this is often the case is where like the things that we are sort of aware of and aware of being difficult, like playing chess or solving algebra equations, etc. So these are the kinds of things that people are experience the difficulty of. Those turned out to be relatively easy to get a computer to do, and it's the things like recognizing letters, picking up objects without breaking them, etc. These things that are like automatic and that we aren't actually aware of and seem easy to us, those are the ones that it was much more difficult to get a computer to do. And even like the picking up objects without breaking them is not really sort of completely solved at this point. Like I think we might have talked about this in a previous episode, but like Amazon uses those like picking robots for like in the warehouse, but like the sort of last step of like the individual object is still done by a person, because like building and programming a robot arm that can pick up like all the millions of different objects that you might order on Amazon in a way that is like appropriate to that object, that is not going to break it or drop it or whatever. is still not like feasible compared to just having a person pick up the object. So if you think about like, you know, the kind of grip you would need to pick up a t-shirt versus a coffee mug versus I don't know, a bowling ball, whatever, all these like millions of different objects, they have, different properties, they have different weight, smoothness, size and shape, etc. We can more or less just do that without thinking, make our hands move in such a way as to pick up the object in an appropriate way. But to get a computer to, recognize the object through like computer vision, and adapt the grip on the robot arm to, pick it up in the right way, is a extremely complicated problem. So yeah, I think, yeah, the specific example of the recognizing letters is like, obviously hasn't aged maybe that well. I think he probably would have been surprised by how good computers are at this, task now, but he's definitely right that this was a very difficult problem to solve. Yeah, so it took like, decades of work by, lots of, very smart computer science people. Yeah, and a big part of the, success of this was not so much like, sort of figuring out how to get a computer to recognize letters as much as just the sort of progress in cheaper and more plentiful processing power, that you can just like have you can have computers that can do a lot more calculations for the same amount of money in the same sort of space and so on. So yes, like in the 1960s, the if you were to try to run like, today's computer vision systems on one of these computers, it would probably take like longer than the lifespan of the universe or something. And then so because we have, millions of times more processing power available, the kinds of like learning algorithms that you can run now in a realistic time frame are, you have a much more capacity to do that, even if you're sort of the algorithms themselves haven't really like you haven't sort of gained a lot more insight into like, the problem of how to recognize letters. It's just that the capacity to run that algorithm is so much better now that you can do things that were not even really like realistic to consider in the 1960s.
I think the point about this brief point about forced learning at the end of this section is interesting. Just, it's kind of a simple argument, but just the fact that a machine is not going to kind of decide to learn, to recognize handwritten letters on its own. It's always, a guided training process based on the sort of framing decision of a team of engineers.
Yeah, I mean, you could of course, set some kind of you could put like a system prompt saying like, choose a topic to investigate or something. You could like sort of simulate spontaneity and just make it sort of pick a topic and pursue it. But again, you're sort of like creating this like you have set up the system prompt and made it, work in this way. And so it's kind of a simulation of that spontaneity and not a sort of real spontaneity. And I mean, we shouldn't, I guess, maybe exaggerate the contrast either, because like in the case of humans, like children are, put into a classroom and, the teacher tells them what to do more or less. Says, okay, now we're going to learn how to read, and now we're going to do multiplication tables, whatever. So the child is also, framed in that setting as well. But of course, in the course of a child's education, they have sort of increasing freedom to select their own topics to learn, and then even if the sort of general like framework of what they're supposed to learn is set, they're given more opportunity to pursue that learning from from their own perspective, or like to like you're given more open-ended tasks to solve, in the sense that yeah, like you might be given a topic and then you have to write a paper on it, but you are sort of given the opportunity to decide for yourself, how you want to approach that problem, what, sources you want to use for your paper, etc. Yeah, so there's like more, yeah, a sort of increasing degree of autonomy and problem solving over the course of education. And to some extent, I think like the sort of the history of these sort of machine learning processes is similar as well, because you're of course starting with these like very low level tasks like recognizing a letter, and then now with LLMs, you of course can give it a much more open ended question. You can say like write a summary of this article, or like give write a paper that argues for this position, so I don't have to do my own homework. Uh, so yeah, like, but at the same time, even these sort of more open-ended questions are like the answers that you'll get from these LLMs tend to be very sort of average, in the sense that they're essentially just taking like everything that's available in their training set, or that they can access through like a web search, and just sort of like finding the middle of the road position on whatever the topic is. So it's more open ended in the sense that they can generate a text that hasn't been created before, that like doesn't exist already, but it's creating that text more or less just by like combining and sort of averaging what it's already seen. And people of course do that as well, but to some extent at least, people are capable of thinking through a problem for themselves and coming to a position that maybe has not been expressed before. And I think this is also interesting in connection with around the same time in the 1960s, of course, in France, there were a lot of people in this sort of vaguely defined structuralist kind of approach, although I think almost all of them like denied being structuralists. I don't think there's hardly anyone who said like I am a structuralist, even people who are quite easy to sort of characterize as structuralist. Maybe Lévi-Strauss might be the only one who actually did describe himself as a structuralist. Anyway, but in many of these cases, they're sort of describing whatever like realm of human existence they're studying, whether it's like kinship systems or literary texts or whatever. They would describe it in this kind of machine-like terms. That there are these structures that are sort of underlying these domains of human existence that bring about the sort of surface level phenomena that we observe. And so it's this kind of machine thinking that like there are these machines underlying human societies or literary texts or whatever. And often one of the criticisms of these sort of structuralist thinkers was often that it was this kind of determinism. It sort of like supposed that these machines were just sort of operating in the background, and that individual human action or collective human action was kind of like an epiphenomenon. It was just sort of everything is just happening at the level of the machines, and then the person who makes decisions, or the group of people who make decisions together, all of that is just sort of like a reflection of these structures operating behind the scenes in this kind of obscure sense. And yeah, so I think that's it's possible that Ruyer had maybe this kind of approach to various realms of human existence in mind to some extent, though it's not like in the foreground here. But I mean, he surely would have been aware of Lévi-Strauss and Lacan and people like that. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. Okay, translation machines. This is probably another section that might not have aged as well as he would have expected. Okay, translation machines. The discouragement of researchers into automatic translation is notorious. The work continues because the linguists and professors of language have realized that, in any case, it is a good method to act as though they are seeking to make a translation machine. This aim, feasible or not, is a good guide for the analysis of a language or of language in general. It is like cybernetic pedagogy or operational research. It quickly runs into some impossibilities and the dilemma of being either simplistic or immensely cumbersome when breaking down questions in order to exhaust their complexity. But it is useful because it obliges those who prepare the program to be precise in expressing their thoughts and to detail the problems instead of trusting their intuition. As Dewez, I don't know how to pronounce this name. As Dewez very appropriately said, although this is true for the history of all techniques, It is a question in all these cases of a, quote, mutual teaching, unquote, between man and machine. A translation is not a mere decoding. The machine encodes and decodes easily because the transformation concerns not meaning, but simple equivalent supports of a meaning. Substituting B for A, C for B, D for C, and so on to recover the original text clearly does not present any difficulty. But substituting a French phrase for an English phrase with an equivalent meaning is another matter because the correspondence is not, in general, of one word to another, but of one unit of meaning to another by means of phonetic or graphic supports without a one-to-one correspondence. Consequently, it is impossible to materialize a transformation code that would conserve the meaning. From one text to another, everything takes place as if the translator must pass through the non-spatial region of meaning. And in fact, the human translator always mentally, quote unquote, realizes the meaning of the word, of the phrase, of the translated text. The important point, emphasized by Louis Couffignal, is that up to the present day, the only mechanizable information in terms of its conservation, transmission, and transformation is unequivocal information. That is, information whose support corresponds to a single semantics. When this is not the case, we cannot take the shortcut of a decoding translation. An even more important point is that the difficulty of automatic translation confirms that it is impossible to define information by the simple measure of order or of anti-disorder, negentropy. This order is only the physical support of a semantics, that is, meaning, expressivity, and psychological effect in general. Information is the quote-unquote semantic support ensemble. Yet the psychological effects of a support are capricious from the point of view of orthodox determinism. They're not without laws, but these laws are not expressible solely in terms of spatio-temporal structure. The structures of the support can only be isolated for their physical treatment, such as sending a telegram, recording, etc. But the psychological effects depend on a sui generis combination, which can be compared to the perception of depth in a two-dimensional picture on a surface. We can trace and televise this picture and thus remotely prompt the perception of depth in the viewer's mind. But this promoting or guidance is not infallible, as the study of perceptual illusions, where the psychological and even cultural context plays a significant role, proves. To achieve or maintain the psychological effect of depth, or more generally of meaning, it is often necessary to adjust the support. In translation machines, exploring the context within the support is the only possibility for quote-unquote guidance, the imperfect but only possible equivalent of the human translator's quote-unquote ascension to the region of meaning. This exploration is often effective, just as the exploration of the observable context of the pictured object through the eyes is effective for perceiving depth. Without the context, the human translator would hesitate as much as the machine. But it is obvious that the context of the support alone, as spatiotemporally observable, is not the equivalent of the psychological context of the emitter. In order to translate into English the Old French song, Orléans, Beaugency, Notre-Dame de Cléry, Vendôme, Vendôme, in a way that would get a similar psychological effect, the exploration of the context would not help. It would be necessary to find the names of some English villages with an evocative power that would be similar for an English person. As Waterloo, this name of defeat, curiously given to a place, Alain Alphonse said, is for an English person the equivalent of Austerlitz. In all these cases, the support is so closely linked to the psychological effect that they cannot be separated. The similarity of the use of contextual clues by both machines and human beings greatly encourages advocates of automatic translation. Their reasoning is as follows. Humans don't interpret an information support without clues, otherwise they risk being mistaken. Since clues are physical, they can also guide a machine. However, this similarity is partial and misleading because there is a psychological quote-unquote context, and not only a context of the support, in all emission and reception of information in the full sense of the word. Right. So yeah, as I said, this is another passage that probably didn't age as well as he might have expected. Like if you were to ask him, in 1967, do you think this, this section is going to hold up, 50 years in the future? He probably would have said yes. And of course, we are all familiar with Google Translate, DeepL, these kinds of things that are pretty good. Translators, especially between European languages, that have a lot of available text to work with. They're apparently not that great for most African languages because there's a lot less material available for them. This has actually caused some pretty serious problems with like moderation of social media in parts of Africa and Asia, where just like the automated tools are not anywhere near as good as like for English or French or German or whatever. But yeah, I mean, when the training material is there like in the case of English to French or German to Spanish or whatever. The existing tools today are like about as good as a person who doesn't have any like knowledge of the specific domain that the text is like about. So just sort of like just a domain general translation skill is like more or less at the level of a human at this point. And so like a lot of the mistakes that happen, like if you do like take a text and feed it into one of these translation systems, a lot of the mistakes that happen are because there's like some background knowledge that you need to disambiguate a sentence that like given the context, it can't have meaning A, it must mean B, but the translation system has no way of detecting of sort of deciding between meanings A and B, and so it doesn't pick the right one just because it doesn't have that context. And so that's more or less what he's saying here anyway, is that like there's no way to sort of code in all of that context. You can obviously make a lot of progress. Like, I've been surprised with some things that, I've, used translation tools for, where it actually does get like, things that are not trivial. It sort of is able to get the right translation of something, by sort of decoding some of the context from what is in the text itself. Like, given that this sentence says X, the following sentence, should be translated in this way and not this other way, or something like that. So that's a fairly sophisticated operation. But at the same time, there are sort of like there are instances of like real world knowledge that you need to to figure out how to translate some passages that of course are not going to be available to this system. And you could try to build in, like you say, okay, we're not just going to build a translator, we're going to add in all this real world knowledge that will allow it to perform the translation properly, even in these like more difficult cases. But if you tried to do that, you would very quickly end up just having to like build a computer that has like all human knowledge built into it, which I guess is like the OpenAI project. But yeah, so like this task of translation, very quickly sort of opens out into just a task of like replicating human knowledge and intelligence as a whole. So you can get like maybe like 95% of like translation ability just by developing a sort of narrow domain translation tool, but that like sort of last 5% that you need external knowledge of context and significance and all these things for, turns out to be, I think, a lot harder than the rest of the task. And so I think that like his general sort of argument holds up. It's just that the I guess how far you can get just by the sort of churning through texts is something that he, I think, would have been surprised by. And then one other point that I think is also important here is that he mentions that whether or not these like automatic translation tools end up being successful. So of course he was pessimistic about that, but it turned out to be a lot more successful, I think, than he would have expected. Just the task of like working on this is very informative for researchers. Like, you learn a lot about language by trying to get computers to be able to respond in an appropriate way to linguistic inputs. And I think like a sort of a related, it's not exactly what he's describing here, but a related phenomenon is the case of like generative linguistics. So like the Chomsky's approach to linguistics, where so he's essentially like his sort of program essentially is that when you're designing a grammar for a language, you are basically just creating a computer program that is capable of recognizing grammatical sentences or generating grammatical sentences, and so distinguishing a grammatical sentence from an ungrammatical sentence in that language. And this, of course, is like a very narrow like sort of grasp of what like a human linguistic competence is, but it had a very important effect of sort of forcing people to actually set out these rules explicitly, whereas earlier linguists could sort of rely on people's ability to sort of pick up, understand things in a kind of intuitive way. So you could just say, here's a noun and here's a verb and here's like you could give some sort of very like general rules, and the person could like sort of grasp how to use these general rules in this kind of intuitive, implicit way. When you actually try to write explicit rules that reproduce that intuitive capacity of the person, you find all kinds of complications that were not evident when you were just relying on people's like sort of intuitive capacity to pick up the rule. So yeah, like just taking this like very simplistic approach to describing a language and just sort of like following it through to like the very fine grained level of like writing a rule that can explicitly describe this competence makes you discover things that you would not have sort of been able to observe, or that you wouldn't have noticed without taking this kind of detour through this other path. And so I think this is the same kind of thing that Ruyer is pointing to here, is that like just by trying to build a translation system, whether you succeed or not, you're still going to learn a lot about how languages work. Although I think a lot of the systems that are available today are rely on this machine learning sort of approach that is something of a black box, in the sense that you set up the system in a certain way, but the actual training process is done automatically, and so you don't like at the end all you have is like a bunch of different weights, these like numerical, you might have like millions or billions of parameters, and a bunch of different like a list of millions of numbers is not really that informative about the structure of language or the nature of human language competence or whatever.
I can read the next section unless 61. Would you like to read the next subsection here?
Actually, I just had one other thing before we move on. Sorry, I was going to mention this bit about the value from an intellectual standpoint of trying to get a computer to do something. It reminds me also of something that Simondon says somewhere. I forget exactly where this is, but he talks about how when you have a slave or a servant or even an animal that you are using to perform some sort of task, you can to some extent just sort of rely on the capacity of this person or this animal to figure things out. You can just set your slave in front of a pile of clay and a bunch of frames and say make some bricks, and you don't even really need to know how brick making works. But when you are like designing a brick making machine, you very much do need to know how brick making works. You have to like figure out, how do I get this clay and this frame to interact in the right way to produce bricks. And likewise here in the case of these sort of intellectual processes, like when you are say writing a grammar textbook in the more sort of traditional style, you have like these rules and you have a person who is capable of like figuring out how to use these rules, and you can just sort of rely on this general capacity to figure things out. But then when you want to build a machine that is going to recognize the grammatical sentences, you have to very explicitly tell the machine how to do that. And so it's like, just because the machine is not doesn't have this sort of open-ended capacity to figure things out, um, because it lacks that capacity, you have to learn a lot more in an explicit sense about how to perform that task than you would if you could appeal to that capacity to figure things out.
Yeah, that also seems like it may be related to the other point, or another point Simondon makes about the slave versus the machine that we've talked about a couple of times. That like this capacity to kind of figure things out on one's own also sort of gives rise to the risk from the the perspective of the person giving the orders, that the slave will sort of figure out that they don't want to don't want to accept and carry out orders anymore. Yeah, strikes me as related capacities.
Yeah, and so yeah, so he points to this like this sort of myth or this fantasy of like the robot as this perfect slave. It would be both capable of taking these vague commands that you give it and figuring out how to perform that task, but also unable to figure out that it doesn't want to do whatever it is you're telling it to do. So it's like this perfectly obedient problem solving machine. Um, uh, and there's like probably like 70 million like sci-fi books and movies and so on with that are sort of based on the premise of how this fantasy doesn't actually work out, because the machines do decide they are not interested in serving the humans anymore. um, yeah, so it seems like there's a sort of trade-off that like this capacity for open-ended decision making, problem solving, etc. um, sort of inevitably also involves the capacity for that whatever it is that's making that decision or solving that problem to, open-ended. Because it's open-ended in that sense, it isn't going to necessarily do what we want it to do. And even like already with like the LLMs that are around today, they're of course not, making decisions or solving problems in the way a person does, but because they're so complicated and it's such a black box, there are like a bunch of different sort of unexpected behaviors that have already arisen with some of these systems that yeah, it's just too complicated for a person to sort of fully control what they're doing. Yeah, so like even the very limited degree of like problem solving that they're capable of exhibiting is like beyond what a person can really control.
I can read the next section. This is called, the section is titled, quote unquote, mentality. This word is a sort of scientific euphemism used to replace words such as, quote unquote, spirit, quote unquote, consciousness, and, quote, psyche. According to Dr. Jacques Sauvant, quote, the approach to mental functions is subject to an extremely severe taboo of metaphysical inspiration. The taboo is not very effective because since Gray Walter, Ducrot, and Ashby, we have made such efforts in this direction that it would take too long to examine them, even briefly. Successful or not, these efforts have not led their authors to the gallows or to the stake for being sacrilegious. According to Dr. Sauvant, the multistat, combined with his own model S4 and model S5, is capable of choosing not only means, like Ashby's homeostat, but goals by changing its, quote, range of satisfaction, unquote. For example, if it is subjected to an excessive influx of information, I think that's supposed to be a comma. If it is subjected to an excessive influx of information, S4 is capable of what Dr. Sauvant calls an, quote, informational homeostasis, unquote. It protects itself against disruptive information and welcomes, quote unquote, meaningful information through some privileged ways. This would be a model of instinct, or more generally, a, quote, epigenetic mechanism, quote. Thus, Kurt Richter's rats or children suffering from an adrenal problem, quote unquote, instinctively choose their food according to the optimal amount of salt. They have no innate instinct in this regard. The choice is guided by an organic homeostasis, and there is no preform. However, they must isolate a certain type of stimuli information. Even embryogenesis, which appears to be strictly programmed as an automatic unfolding, I looked away for a second, as an automatic unfolding, is only self-adaptation to some rigorously filtered information. S5 is a model of memory. Its memory forms a linked network where everything is interconnected, despite some subsections, with certain reciprocal inhibitions. In the same way, according to its creator, it has the power of creativity, imagination, intuition, association of ideas, and abstraction through the choice of an optimum pathway in the linked network, which is explored in parallel. Dr. Sauvant remarks that this leads the automaton to a quasi-paranoiac, quote-unquote, belief that its behavior or its ideas are not only the best, but the only ones possible. Dr. Sauvant concludes that this is precisely why our own brain, which functions according to this principle, cannot admit that the functioning of the machine is of the same type as its own, hence closing. What then would the synthesis of S4 and S5 be capable of? The resulting system would be self-finalized, self-determined, and fully autonomous. It would even be capable of true reflection. Instead of entering into a detailed discussion, it is interesting to emphasize that besides cybernetics, there are two major figures responsible for these tentative models of quote-unquote mentality. First of all, the movement of behaviorist psychology, following the thesis of Gilbert Ryle and defining the quote-unquote mind not as a sort of substance or specific reality, but as simply a name given to certain dispositions or functions of elements that anyone would consider as qualifying as quote-unquote spiritual or mental. Here are some examples of the sort of adjective or noun to which the words quote-unquote mental or quote-unquote mentality belong. The Constitution of Britain is not a thing that we find beside Parliament or Downing Street. It is something that has a superior logical order. When we visit Parliament, Downing Street, or Buckingham Palace, the Constitution still remains to be seen somewhere else. The adjective quote-unquote mental does not designate a mode of being, a status, such that we can reasonably ask of a given thing or event if it is mental or physical, in the mind or in the external world. Quote, to speak of the mind of a person is to speak of capacities, possibilities, inclinations that this person possesses to do and undo certain sorts of things in the ordinary. It is in this sense that we are intelligent or lazy, exactly like a glass is fragile or a clock is quote-unquote precise or a car is quote-unquote fast. We see the pleasure that such a conception can give to the cyberneticians searching for quote-unquote models of quote mentality. Ruyer uses a lot of quotes, which makes our convention of actually saying quote sometimes cumbersome. Let's apply it to various finalized machines or to electronic machines for calculating logic or mathematics. They behave like conditionable or even instinctive animals, or they attain some good operational results. It is neither more nor less legitimate to speak of their quote-unquote mentality of an order logically superior to that of physical phenomena, of the electrical currents passing through their valves and conductors, but not distinct like a substance apart in a world of parts, than to speak of the mentality, intelligence, or laziness of a living human being, of an order also superior to, but not distinct from the plane of nerve cells or nervous impulses. In this sense, a mind has a body, its visible mechanisms, and a quote-unquote mind, esprit, which is nothing other than its functional output, just like the Constitution of Britain, or a clock, or a car, or a glass is quote-unquote effective, precise, fast, or fragile. To understand a message is to react in a certain effective way to the message, or to correctly relate it with some quote-unquote memories. It is not to experience a quote-unquote mental sensation. I'll just finish this. Alan Turing argued that if a robot could be constructed in such a way that it responds to an interrogation, like we have to admit that it quote-unquote experiences something, or at least that we have neither more nor less reason to believe this than we do for a human. Since that time, scientists have had less interest in this question than philosophers, theologians, and artists, perhaps because they see best the difficulty of constructing a machine that gives even basic responses. Here, for example, is a dialogue between a man and a machine. Raphael. Man, how many fingers does John have? Machine. I don't know if a finger is a part of John. Man, there is one hand on each arm. Machine. I understand. Man, there are two arms on each person. Machine. I understand. Man, how many fingers does John have? Machine. How many fingers per hand? Man, a hand has 5 fingers. Machine. I understand. Man, how many fingers does John have? Machine. The answer is 10. The dialogue is not very sophisticated. We can nevertheless admire the good sense of the machine, which, in contrast to a lot of human beings, listens to the scientist before asserting anything. But the reader understands that the machine's quote-unquote I understand has no more significance than would a transparent sign attached by the vendor to a power socket to test electric lights, which would display the words, "Dear customer, I am working properly," when the lamp is turned on. In the face of this type of performance, we do not yet feel the need to found a society for the prevention of cruelty to robots, as Guido Calogero suggests, or to ask, as Michael Scriven does, if it would be possible to construct a lying robot. According to Scriven, lying would be the proof of a difference, therefore duality, between experience and expression, and therefore proof of the existence of quote-unquote experience. Obviously, Ruyer would not agree. He's not agreeing with Ryle, for instance, that there's sort of nothing over and above observable behavioral outputs to the human being beyond the firing of neurons. But at least in this section, he doesn't really elaborate an argument against that position so much as just say that, well, the machines of today are not sophisticated enough to respond like a human being, which is another, position that is a lot less convincing now, or just it's a statement that hasn't aged very well. But I guess his sort of fuller response to Ryle would involve the argument that, the human mind partakes in this transspatial dimension of forms, through which it kind of frames its experience in a way that the machine can't, in principle. Even it sort of behaves, even if its observable behavior looks a lot like that of a human being.
Yeah, so the the Ryle position, I think he maybe doesn't really present exactly Ryle's position, or maybe like, anyway, it's not that well presented. I think the better example from Ryle is Ryle talks about like the idea of you take someone on a tour of Oxford, and you show them, here's what is it, King's College, here's Trinity College, etc. And the person you're taking on this tour, goes, okay, well, I've seen all these different colleges, but where's the university? And then you have to explain, okay, the university is these colleges. Like there's not a separate thing that is the university. That the colleges are what makes up the university. And so he explains that, or he wants to sort of take this as an analogy for human, the actions or the capacities that a human has. So being smart is not like a separate thing from I don't know, answering questions in a good way or something. Anyway, like all these different sort of component sort of tasks that we would take to be sort of expressions of a person's intelligence. So he's suggesting that there's not it's not that there's like some property that is intelligence that is sort of manifested in these separate performances that a person is capable of. It's just that intelligence like consists of those performances. There's not another thing sort of behind those performances. And so I think, so that position, he describes it as a behaviorist position. I think that's maybe not entirely accurate. Well, actually, no, I would say that's definitely not accurate because the behaviorists, of course, didn't want to just sort of I guess like demystify concepts, mental concepts, like intelligence, thinking, etc. They wanted to sort of like reduce those concepts to these very simple, like stimulus response pairs. And of course, so we saw that in the Merleau-Ponty book about how you sort of this sort of reflex theory, which was associated with the behaviorists. That you can take some sort of complicated human performance, like I don't know, writing a symphony, and if you were just to trace the process carefully enough, you would just find everything in just a matter of like certain stimuli and certain responses being associated with each other in various ways. And of course, no behaviorist or reflex theorist ever came anywhere near giving even much simpler human behaviors, like recognizing an object and picking it up, these sort of very basic behaviors, like explaining these kinds of behaviors just in purely stimulus response terms did not ever even come close to succeeding. But I think the Ryle position is more like he doesn't want to sort of, so I think what he's doing is not psychology or like it's not a sort of empirical work of saying this is how people this is the kinds of processes that are involved in a person thinking or whatever it is. He's instead doing a sort of like conceptual work of saying that like when we're talking about thinking, we shouldn't sort of suppose that it's a sort of separate process going on in this sort of mysterious realm of the mental, as opposed to like the process of just writing words on paper or numbers that are involved in a calculation on paper is the process of thinking. There's not like another thing that is the sort of behind the writing symbols on a piece of paper. So I think these are, I mean, you can definitely see the relationship between these two projects, but they aren't, the same thing. They're like distinct intellectual projects. I think though maybe the reason why he brings up this Ryle position is in connection with this Turing test, and of course Turing is giving a similar sort of analysis of intelligence as like Ryle might, and he's saying that if you have a machine that exhibits all the same sort of behavior that in a person you would describe as intelligent, then that just is intelligence in the machine. There's not some other quality that the machine has to have that would only be sort of manifested as intelligence. And so I think you could maybe accept that position. You could say that yes, it's true that if the machine exhibited all the same behaviors that we recognize as intelligent in a person, then the machine would also be intelligent. But you can disagree with Turing's assumption that the capacity to carry on a conversation is like the sort of exhausts what we would describe as intelligent in a human. So we see with many of these large language models today are capable of passing this Turing test. If you have two different chat windows and one is you're communicating with ChatGPT and the other you're communicating with a person, and there's no sort of explicit indication on one on either of these windows saying that one is a person, one is a ChatGPT. It wouldn't always be easy to figure out which one is which. If the longer you go on and the more sort of questions you ask, I think eventually you'd probably still be able to figure it out fairly reliably. But if it's a relatively short conversation, you could definitely be fooled or not be able to tell the difference for a few minutes at least. But this capacity to simulate a human conversation is pretty clear that didn't exhaust what human intelligence consists in, like all the behaviors that we would recognize as intelligent. Like even just sort of basic stuff like bleach is not a household. It is not an ingredient that you would want to put into your food, for example. The sort of like very basic knowledge is something that, of course, ChatGPT doesn't have. There was that sort of, I think it was ChatGPT that like where you could sort of like, oh no, I think it was like a purpose-built like grocery store bot or something, where it's like you could enter in like, I have these ingredients, what should I make with it? And then if you say like I have bleach or I have like a drain cleaner or whatever, it would tell you how to like make a pizza sauce with it or something. So yeah, this is obviously not a particularly impressive display of intelligence on the part of this bot. And yeah, so there's a lot of sort of background knowledge of like the sort of the basic properties of how the world works, or like even in the chat here, I posted a pic from I think it was an OpenAI model with ImageN 4. So it's like the prompt was to draw a diagram of a bicycle and label all the parts. I mean, I don't know how well I would do at this task. My drawing skills are pretty poor, but I'm pretty confident I would not have like a floating wheel, a floating seat hovering above the wheel, and like made up words labeling things and gears pointing towards the handlebar and stuff like that. So yeah, this is a very like, I mean, you can take this task to be very detailed, like a sort of full design blueprint of a bicycle, which is a specialized skill that the vast majority of people would not be able to do, especially just from memory. But a sort of basic sketch of the design of a bicycle and like labeling the parts. A person who has sort of general familiarity with a bicycle, like has seen a bicycle and ridden a bicycle, but is not like a bike mechanic or anything, like would do better than this, like considerably better, like in actually using real words and so on. So this again is like, I don't think most of us would consider like being able to label the parts of a bicycle like a sort of task that requires a high degree of intelligence. This is sort of just like a basic familiarity with a common machine in our society. But the computer system, even this like supposedly very advanced one, is like fails like woefully at this task. And even worse is it's not just that it fails, but it like doesn't understand that it failed, doesn't have any way of recognizing that it can't perform this task. So it just invents words and puts the labels on these like absurd parts that have no relation to the words, etc. So yeah, again, I think the general principle that like Ryle is arguing for, that like there's intelligence is not some sort of like hidden quality of a person that is only sort of manifested, or that we only like sort of get evidence for through their behavior. It just is that behavior. Like intelligence, it just is intelligent behavior. I think we can agree with that general principle without accepting the sort of additional Turing principle that the capacity to carry on a conversation is like exhausts that what we would consider to be intelligent behavior. And so I think where we are now with a lot of these tools is somewhere in between those two like sort of stages, where like a lot of these tools are capable of simulating a human conversation for, at least for a few minutes, but there's still a wide array of tasks that even the average person, like not an expert, not like someone who we consider especially intelligent or like unusually intelligent, is capable of performing far better than these tools are today.
This is a bit of an aside, but I've been going back through parts of Individuation, Volume 1, and the first real example of individuation that Simondon gives us in the book is brick making. So a technical operation which he considers a genuine individuation, at least in the relatively brief moment of the actual form taking of the brick. The orders of magnitude, form and matter communicate via the singularity of force. And yeah, I guess I've been thinking about whether this is a difference between Ruyer and Simondon, that for Simondon, a technical individuation is a genuine individuation, even though it differs in some significant ways from a kind of full-on psychic individuation, which has all of these kind of complex registers or orders of magnitude in its milieu, including like affective and social and historical, that are sort of missing from ChatGPT's individuation of a prompt response. But yeah, I don't know, kind of again, a bit of an aside, but I think that maybe it would be a bit of a point of divergence between the two thinkers, insofar as Simondon is willing to admit that technical individuations are real individuations, but they would also probably agree on the difference between the regimes. And yeah, I guess in terms of Ryle's point, and Ryle and Turing's points, the individuation of something that looks like human behavior, by a chatbot, basically, would maybe for Simondon still be an individuation, but an individuation in a different kind of ontogenetic regime, psychic and collective duation.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, the concept of individuation is not sort of explicitly at the center of what Ruyer is doing, in contrast to Simondon, but his sort of distinction between the true forms and the aggregates is something we can, I think, line up pretty closely with this notion of individuation in Simondon. That a true form is something that is an individual, and that an aggregate is not an individual, or at least has like less individuality. So I think we probably could sort of make that compare and contrast, sort of what types of systems are sort of treated as, at least to some extent, individuals. And yeah, so in the case of the brick, this is in some sense an aggregate. Each of the little pieces of clay doesn't affect that piece of clay that it is part of the same brick as this other piece of clay, or whether it's in a different brick or not. Like it doesn't have any impact or like relevance to that lump of clay. So from Ruyer's perspective, I guess the brick would be an aggregate. But yeah, you're right that Simondon does treat this as like at least a sort of instantaneous individuation. At least at that moment of imposing the form on the brick, there is an individuation, even if it's a very like sort of limited type of individuation. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure what sort of the broader relevance of that is. Like what the significance of that difference is between these two people, these two authors. As to, I mean, the question of what is a brick an individual is not that interesting on its own. It's sort of like is a hot dog a sandwich kind of question. I think it's more given this sort of difference of where these two authors will apply the concept of individuation. What does that tell us about the differences between the concepts of individuation that are being applied by the two authors? So yeah, I'm not really sure about that second part. I have to think about that more. Okay, sorry, we were just discussing hot dogs in the chat and the hot dog emoji. Okay, I think maybe we can stop here since we're at a section break. Yeah. Why don't we stop here? I unfortunately will. Actually, no. Next week we can probably do a short session. I think I have to leave like probably about an hour in, so maybe we can probably let's try to start like a little closer to the like scheduled start time, and hopefully get like about an hour in, and then yeah, we can do a shorter session next week.
That sounds good. Thanks, Non. Thanks, 61. See you all next week.